Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This is presented by Data Networks and our partner Dell Technologies. My name is Dwayne McKenzie and I'm the Infrastructure and Security Solutions Architect at Data Networks. Data Networks is a Dell Technologies Platinum partner and a leading IT solution provider focused on simplifying enterprise IT for education, government, and our commercial organizations. Today's session is called Building Cyber Resiliency and is presented by Patrick Nigro, the Data Protection Specialist, along with a demo by Jeremy McGill, a systems engineer and my counterpart, both from Dell Technologies. First off, a little housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them via the chat window in Zoom. Then we will then be able to address them during the presentation or probably at the closing Q&A. With that, I'd like to turn this over to Patrick.
Great. Thank you, Dwayne. And thank you to the full Data Networks team. Really excited to be with all of you this morning for some, depending on where you're located, but welcome nonetheless. My name's Patrick Nigro, and as Dwayne mentioned, I'm a data protection specialist with Dell Technologies. So with my current role, get the opportunity to work with organizations primarily up and down the East Coast, helping them solidify their next generation data protection strategies. And arguably the #1 discussion that our team is having with municipalities, schools, colleges, universities, private sector, you name it, is around improving cyber resiliency, which is the topic for today's discussion. So joining me is my right-hand man, Jeremy McGill. Jeremy's been a long-time Dell EMCer. Prior to joining our team, he spent about 20 years within the EMC data center, brings a ton of insight and experience to the table. So to set the stage for the rest of today's conversation, we're going to be talking about the ways in which ransomware and other sophisticated cyber attacks are evolving, what it means to have a cyber resilience strategy, and how that can actually differ from a traditional cybersecurity approach. And finally, Dell EMC's good, better, best model when it comes to cyber resilience, and how that really compares with other offerings on the market. So as Dwayne mentioned, we'll be monitoring the chat for any questions. Anything we can't answer immediately, we'll make sure to circle back with at the very end during the Q&A session. So without any further ado, giddy up, let's get into it. All right, so for those of you out there that aren't familiar with Dell Technologies as it relates to data protection, there's a lot of different things that we're doing nowadays. We'll only spend a couple minutes on this, but across the board, there's a number of ways that we're helping customers take advantage of proven and modern data protection solutions nowadays. If you look across our entire portfolio, a lot of that centers around our PowerProtect solutions. For those of you that aren't familiar with latest generation Dell Technologies, think of Power as the latest generation or branding for all of our solutions. So PowerProtect when it comes to data protection solutions. When it comes to PowerProtect appliances, this is an area where we really deliver 3 different flavors to the market, being our modern converged appliances, purpose-built backup appliances or target appliances, and finally, software-defined protection, storage, and software. One of the really nice things about Dell Technologies is that we're able to do not only all the traditional or meet your needs for traditional applications, but we do all the hard things as well. All the way from physical to virtual through modern as-a-service workloads, all built with data invulnerability and security hardening at the lowest cost to protect. When it comes to the cloud, we've really been embracing multi-cloud and hybrid cloud architecture for a number of years now. So when it comes to being able to back up, protect, and recover data within that type of multi and hybrid cloud environment, we really give you some nice flexibility and choice. Whether that's for in-cloud protection, backing up, replicating to and from the cloud, disaster recovery to the cloud, long-term retention, snapshot management, continuous data protection, SaaS protection, you name it, we have a solution for you. This is an area that's arguably been one of our fastest growing areas within the Dell Technologies portfolio. In fact, just over the past 12 months, we've actually seen 110% year-over-year growth when it comes to protection in the public hyperscalers, specifically AWS, Azure, and GCP. We have over 5.6 exabytes of data protected in the public cloud today. Now, many of you out there are leveraging multiple cloud providers. This is another area where we're extremely focused on with our PowerProtect for multi-cloud offering. Real advantage there is for those of you taking advantage of multiple hyperscalers, the AWS, Azure's, GCP's, VMC's, Oracle clouds of the world. We can give you a single global namespace for backup and recovery, and really taking advantage of low latency, high throughput connections adjacent to the public cloud providers. Additional kicks, $0 egress costs for Azure and Oracle Cloud, and 75% reduction in egress costs for AWS, GCP, and VMC. So cloud's a major area of focus for us, as it is for many of our customers. And of course, there's a number of architectural and cost considerations in play there, something we'd be happy to discuss with you at the appropriate time in the future. When it comes to VMware and automation, a lot of our customers are looking to be able to take advantage of next generation capabilities there, whether it's integrating into tools like ServiceNow for automation or other third-party solutions such as Ansible, Puppet, Chef. Same goes for the VMware Automation Suite. We have a first and best relationship with VMware to really be able to optimize the protection of VMware workloads. And finally, the topic of today's conversation, cyber recovery. We'll be getting much more into this, but when it comes to cyber resilience or your ability to successfully recover from a cyber attack which compromises your network and data, we have a dedicated solution within our portfolio with over 6 years of maturity on the market. So having said that, let's talk a little bit more about cyber resiliency, right? So this wouldn't be a cyber-related session this afternoon if we didn't have a couple stories or statistics to share with you. And the important question to ask as we're going through this is, why is it relevant? Well, what we're seeing and working with organizations across the US is that a lot of folks are looking at their existing security tools and infrastructure and trying to figure out their go-forward strategy as it relates to things like data recovery. Last year, Deloitte conducted a future cyber survey, and they reached out to organizations across the United States, and a couple really interesting things came from that survey. The first one being that data integrity is now the #1 cyber concern for organizations. Now, what does that mean to me? Well, historically, most organizations were mostly concerned with the confidentiality of their data, having their data get stolen by someone else. And that's obviously still a concern for many folks, but the lens has shifted more towards ensuring that data can remain stable. And the second interesting finding was that the loss of revenue due to operational disruption or the loss of an ability of a municipality to deliver services to their constituents is the biggest perceived impact of cyber attacks. Previously, we were thinking a lot about things like brand damage, costs of a breach, costs of litigation, downtime. Those are all serious considerations, right? But a lot of folks are looking at their cybersecurity strategies and they're telling themselves, I need to ensure that my data and systems have integrity because I need to protect my ability to deliver my revenue streams and services to my customers. So the reason we're all here this afternoon, probably in agreement that we're dealing with a new problem here. Well, what's causing it? Who are we really talking about? It's important to recognize in the lens of cyber and modern cyber bad actors that they take a variety of different forms. And a lot of these sophisticated bad actors have different motivations, techniques, even different platforms from which they launch their attacks. I always say that today's threat actors are more sophisticated, persistent, and better funded than they've ever been before. What's interesting to think about here, though, is that all too often when Jeremy and I are having conversations with our customers, a lot of the times they're guarding against a very specific type of cyber attack or cyber threat actor, what I would consider more garden variety criminals. And that type of narrow focus can actually put you at risk, right? Earlier going back several months ago now, the US Department of Treasury actually issued an advisory alert to organizations stating that paying a ransom to an entity on the SDN list of prohibited organizations can actually violate US law. So in the lens of state, local organizations, commercial and enterprise organizations, often see examples of crime. Think attack vectors such as ransomware, malware, but more and more frequently, we're seeing more sophisticated attacks targeting insiders. That's not to say that one of your employees can go rogue. It's possible, but more often than not, we're seeing more sophisticated attacks compromise an insider's credentials and who have privileged access to your systems, which becomes an increasing threat to many organizations. And of course, for many of you out there, all the more so in certain sectors, you have other considerations in play when we start to think about hacktivism, terrorism, and even warfare. A good cyber resilience strategy really takes all of these threat actors into account. So when we start talking about cybersecurity, I know many of you out there are probably familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework. For those of you who have not heard of this before, NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And many organizations across the globe really refer to this standard in terms of defining approaches to cybersecurity and aligning technologies to the NIST framework. So you have your identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover pillars. And I'd expect that most of you have technologies mapping to those pillars today, whether that's access controls, antivirus software, firewalls, multi-factor authentication, login packet collection, maybe even a SIM, right? What we're seeing a lot of around here in the States is that most customers do a great job with identify, detect, and protect, especially given limited resources. Some of you may even have some response planning and communications in place. And today I tell you to keep doing what you're doing, keep it up, keep investing, keep finding new ways to detect and protect. But for the sake of today's conversation, what I want to focus in on is around recovery. And when I say recovery, I mean recovery from a successful cyber attack, one that's able to bypass all those preventative-based controls that you have in place. And this is really where that notion of modern cyber resiliency comes into play. So very important to differentiate from cybersecurity. Cyber resilience can be a form of cybersecurity, but cybersecurity on its own isn't necessarily cyber resilience. Hopefully I didn't lose you there. But a good question to be able to ask and even communicate with your teammates following today's conversation is, do your existing security plans also focus on a physical loss of data and hardware rather than just outside intrusion? The vast majority of the time when we're having conversations with local customers, the answer to that is no. So let's talk a little bit more about why data recovery and cyber resilience is a vital component to an overarching protection strategy. So as we mentioned, threat actors are getting more sophisticated, more intelligent, persistent, better funded. The reality is that if these cyber bad actors want to get in, they're going to find a way. So when we think about all those preventative-based controls that many organizations have in place, It's a necessary evil, and it's absolutely a best practice. But you have to recognize that the types of attacks that many folks are dealing with nowadays are different than what we were experiencing even 12, 18, 24 months ago. There's a popular phrase in information security. It's that hackers used to hack in, now they log in. So what that tells me is that a lot of the bad actors that we're dealing with today are oftentimes bypassing those traditional security controls. In the lens of this particular study, the scarier part is that they're often sitting idle for weeks or months at a time, mapping out every nook and cranny of your network until they decide it's the appropriate time to release their malicious code. A lot of the times we're having conversations with customers who have built out a thorough incident response plan, but they've never put too much time and effort into thinking about where they keep that plan. If a ransomware attack were to lock you out of your network, would you have access to your incident response plan? Is it sitting on a production network that's been compromised? How would you even contact your peers in IT or leadership? Not by email, right? How would you contact anyone, including administrators? Picture your corporate systems are down, including Active Directory. It's all inaccessible. In the IT worlds, when the going gets tough, when it comes to data, the idea is that you're always able to lean in on your backups. After all, backups serve as that insurance policy, that second copy of data in case something happens to your production copies, right? If only it were that simple. So what we're finding is that ransomware and other cyber bad actors, they've learned that they have a better chance of achieving their end goal, either getting paid or destroying data, if no backup is available for recovery. So probably understood by most folks on the phone today that traditional backups are under attack. And unfortunately, when we're talking about backups, there's a number of vulnerable points because they were really designed for accessibility, not necessarily for cyber resilience. So even going back 12 plus months ago now, we on the Dell EMC side had noticed a 75% increase in cyber variants that were targeting snapshots, clone copies, shadow copies, and backup catalogs. And I want to emphasize that that was pre-COVID. And in the past 12 months, we've only seen exponential rate of these types of sophisticated attacks. What that tells me is that threat actors don't want to leave traditional recovery methodologies as an option. So in addition to deploying things like ransomware, as we mentioned earlier, some cyber bad actors may be an insider or have credentials to be able to go in and outright delete backups. Now, we were speaking with a local organization who had experienced a recent attack. And in that case, the cyber bad actors had infiltrated a network. They'd gone in, set up some RDP connections to monitor what was going on, some keyloggers, deploying tools like Mini-Cats to steal passwords. And they were actually able to log in and destroy everything. Right? So we know that IT backup admins, you're going to be main targets for compromise because your access is trusted. In addition to you as an administrator, your master server, backup catalog, that's typically going to contain a lot of important information, right? So if a cyber bad actor is able to encrypt or delete that data, it can make a backup, one, take much longer, and in some cases, two, even keep you from being able to recover. And what we're finding is all too often in a best case scenario, if you're trying to protect those revenue streams and services that we were talking about earlier, and it takes you 2+ weeks to be able to clean up the data, then even longer to be able to get back up and running and recovered, you're going to be in a world of hurt, right? So when we're talking about master servers, backup catalogs, same thing could be argued for any type of media server. Finally, when we think about types of backup targets out there, you have things like file systems, tape, cloud. All those may hold some of your backups, but they're also being targeted, right? File systems, especially those accessible via CIFS or NFS, they're often targeted with data being encrypted or deleted. A lot of folks are nowadays thinking about going back in time to tapes and It's a nice thought, right? Tapes are offline, but generally they're going to require a catalog for a speedy recovery. And we already talked about, oftentimes those catalogs are going to be targeted. And finally, from a cyber resilience perspective, cloud's an interesting one, right? But cloud isn't necessarily inherently secure location for backups. It's really just different from production environment. So data there can typically be deleted immediately by anyone with access privileges, and the cloud is always available, always on for access. So I know that shared a lot of information there, and we'll tie back and go a little bit more in depth talking to some of those challenges shortly. But I do want to highlight that last piece being the cloud, because that's an interesting one. And as we go on, we'll talk about some of the modern terms and buzzwords that you're hearing about recently, like air gapping, isolation, immutability. The cloud is an interesting one, right? Because a lot of other vendors are recommending that customers sends their data to the cloud, a la a 3-2-1 strategy, circa 2010, right? But what they fail to tell you is when it comes to an attack taking place, the first course of action that your information security team is likely going to put in place is taking down your network, right? But don't worry about that. Don't worry about that, right? All you have to do is send that data back from the cloud over the exposed network, and voila, you can recover quickly and efficiently. Much more to that story, right? But the important thing to keep in mind here is that traditional backups, traditional recovery methods, including snapshots, backups, even DR copies, as we'll get into in a moment, they're all under attack. But don't take my word for it. Some of you may be familiar with Ryuk ransomware. It's a very popular variant that's been wreaking havoc on organizations of all shapes and sizes over the past year. This is a screenshot received by an organization here in the Mid-Atlantic during a recent high-profile attack. So our team's now helping this customer who is leveraging an older third-party backup software. But the interesting thing to keep in mind here is that the message clearly calls out that backups have been encrypted or deleted, right? Building upon this point, there's been numerous studies that show when multiple data protection vendors and solutions are deployed, as an example, separate backup hardware, separate backup software providers, that organizations are more likely to experience increased downtime and data loss as a result of an outage. And that's only increasing as a result of cyber attacks, which are oftentimes compromising, at the very least, targeting traditional recovery methods. Here's another example. This one's from SE Magazine, a couple months old now, right? First half of the article, you can see a screenshot. I found it pretty enlightening. What does it say? Backup attacks typically wipe away an organization's backup infrastructure and storage snapshots before locking and encrypting file systems. You get the point, right? This is typically the point in a conversation when I'm working with customers where they'll say, this is all great stuff, Patrick, but we already have a disaster recovery plan in place. If something happens to our production storage, our backups, let's talk about DR for a moment. What is DR, disaster recovery? Well, the idea is that you continuously replicate data and move it as quickly as possible from one location to another, right? That whole replication process takes place on the network. And the idea is if you experience some type of incident at location A, you're able to bring up your applications at location B. Now, what happens when you introduce cyber bad actors and bad data into that very same DR environment? Well, the bad actor gains access to your primary data center, then the malware will likely target your backup applications, as we've already talked about. And then we start thinking about things like flat networks, synchronization, replication. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about your primary data center mirroring backups to your DR data center, it can also mirror bad data, right? So the backup tools that you have in place that are replicating to your DR site or potentially the cloud, oftentimes they can actually propagate these types of infections and malicious code. So you may not be able to recover. Very important point here. Always share this with customers. Not all copies serve the same backup and recovery purposes. So whereas traditional disaster recovery was really focused on natural disasters, fires, flood, power outage, snowstorms, as we're pretty familiar with recently, DR as a practice wasn't really founded on recovering from advanced persistent threats. You know, when we're talking about these types of individuals and bad actors who are actively trying to circumvent the controls that you have in place. Another great question or something for you to write down, share with your teammates following today's conversation. I know Jeremy and I have this on almost a daily basis, have these discussions on almost a daily basis, right? But question would be, have you ever had to declare an official disaster? 97% of organizations out there will answer no to that. Part two of the question, what do you think has a greater probability of happening in the next 24 months? That you'll have to recover from a catastrophic event causing a data center outage or a catastrophic attack that will lock you out of your applications and data? 99% of the time, the answer that we're hearing from customers is recovering from some type of cyber-related incident, right? So that's not to push back, that's not to hate on disaster recovery. That's absolutely an area that Dell is focused on and can help, that helps many of you already today. But as you're having this conversation, something interesting to think about, right? If you consider that even an equal possibility or more than likely that you'd have to recover from a cyber attack, wouldn't it be prudent to be able to reevaluate where you're spending your budget today and consider a cyber recovery architecture? So we talked about most organizations are on the same page there, but let's talk about what other bodies, federal bodies, regulatory bodies are doing nowadays, what they're recommending to customers when it comes to cyber resilience. Short answer, within just the past few months, there's a boatload of new regulatory and legal trends that all agree on the basic premise for offline, logically air-gapped backup architecture. So when it comes to protecting things like backups from newer ransomware variants, the fundamental rule is that ransomware can't affect what it can't touch. So the single most important thing that you can do in terms of protecting mission-critical data is to implement an air gap. And when we're talking about an air gap really refers to placing an insurmountable obstacle between a potential ransomware attack and your backups. What we'll talk about more in a moment here would be an air-gapped vault architecture. But as we go through what some of the other bodies are saying within here in the United States, you look at CISA, it's critical to maintain offline encrypted backups of data. You look at a number of other organizations, including the FBI, the US Department of Treasury, you name it, right? Everyone seems to be on the same page here. FDIC, FFIC, NIST. When it comes to cyber resiliency, your ability to bounce back when the going gets tough, the number one thing that you can do as an organization is ensure that critical data resides off network and isolated from a cyber attack. So having a dedicated hardened digital vault with physical and operational air gap is the best way to ensure data recovery following a successful cyber attack that's able to compromise the rest of your network. So how's Dell Technologies approaching this challenge? Well, just like Farmers Insurance, when it comes to cyber resilience, we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. And this is a particular use case that hasn't just been a topic in marketing blogs for us for the past 6 months. We've really been laser focused on this going back to 2014. And that's a big differentiator when it comes to Dell Technologies. This whole story and solution, PowerProtect Cyber Recovery, was really born in the advent of the Sony Pictures attack, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So we're going back in time a number of years, but what was interesting about that attack is that a nation state, likely North Korea, targeted Sony Pictures at the time, and the goal was to be able to wipe Sony off the face of the earth, to destroy the integrity of their systems and their data. So since then, Dell and EMC have worked together. Now Dell Technologies have worked together to productize this PowerProtect cyber recovery solution. And today we're the only vendor in the world to be able to offer off-network air-gap isolation, retention-locked copies within that vaulted environment, and full content analytics inside the vaulted environment to be able to quickly recover known good data. If this history weren't enough, for you, a few months ago, we were very excited to announce that Sheltered Harbor, which is a nonprofit formed by many of the US's top financial organizations going back several years ago, they actually validated and certified our vaulting technology and vaulting standards with the Sheltered Harbor program. So for those of you that are financial organizations who are looking to comply with Sheltered Harbor, we have a turnkey data vaulting solution that meets their very stringent standards, only solution in the world to do so. For those of you who are outside of the financial world, Sheltered Harbor is the go-to standard when it comes to cyber resilience and data vaulting standards. And those of you who, as I mentioned, who are outside of financial realm can take advantage of that same best of breed technology for protecting your organization, regardless of your size or type of organization that you're a part of. So as we're going on here, I'm going to be handing things over to Jeremy in a moment, but this is what I was talking about earlier when it comes to Dell Technologies' good, better, best methodology. So as we were discussing earlier, really the foundation of our portfolio is around our PowerProtect appliances, whether that be our modern converged integrated data protection appliances or purpose-built software agnostic target appliances, or our software-defined appliances. Our PowerProtect solutions really give you some nice flexibility when it comes to protecting data as an underlying storage repository. Now, when we think about good, better, best, we'll be focusing in on this best capabilities when it comes to air gapping, isolation, intelligence, immutability, as Jeremy will get more into in a moment. But a quick story as we lead into that. There's an SC on our team whose son is in middle school and he's really into gaming. And the way that he's able to beat all of his friends and break records online is that he's able to go in, manipulate his computer's clock, reset the time, and give himself unlimited time to nearly perfect every round of the game. In a very similar fashion, we're seeing more and more sophisticated variants of ransomware, which are actually targeting NTP clocks, manipulating a computer's clock to make that clock think that 6 months, 12 months, 18 months of retention period has passed, thereby wiping out all retained copies of backups. Right? So the scary part about this is that in this case, they don't have to break anything. Similar to that middle school gamer, all they're doing is manipulating the clock, as I was talking about earlier. So I would absolutely recommend, if nothing else, in evaluating future protection storage solutions, that they are taking into account what we're seeing in terms of these more sophisticated attacks, NTP clock tampering, as that's quickly becoming one of the top ways cyber bad actors are getting a hold of backup copies. And we'll talk more about it, but from my understanding, Dell Technologies is the only solution on the market who's accounting for this type of NTP clock drift today. But let's talk about the high-level architecture really quickly here. One of the most frequent questions that our team receives is, I retention lock my backup data in production. Why would I need a dedicated air-gapped cyber vault? Well, as we talked about earlier, anything in production is going to be accessible and can be subject to compromise. And if we look at some of the best practices shared by those regulatory and federal bodies a couple minutes ago, and regulatory requirements, which are coming down the pike in the next 12 to 18 months, they're all focused on air gapping and offline immutability, right? So when it comes to having recovery planning in place, processes, procedures, runbooks, being able to take advantage of modern capabilities like analytics to identify clean gold copies, that is all going to be dependent on having this type of air-gapped vault architecture where you have a clean room for data recovery purposes. So the really nice thing about Dell Technologies PowerProtect Cyber Recovery is we're providing you with this type of cyber recovery vault infrastructure. And as Jeremy will talk about, the process in terms of taking your critical applications within your environment, isolating them, retention logging them, and then conducting analysis into that vaulted environment that's critical for being able to reduce the time to recover and ensuring that you have clean gold copies that are available for recovery. As I mentioned, when it comes to reducing things like RPO, RTO, and being able to identify clean gold copies for recovery, that's where the analytics portion of our solution, what we call CyberSense, really becomes an important component. Right? So analytics are going to help determine whether a data set is valid and usable for recovery, or whether it's been altered or corrupted, even if it's living within that vaulted environment. The way that works with our CyberSense solution is that we're analyzing full content of the backup files within that vaulted environment. We're looking at over 100 different observations per file, including things like entropy, similarity, deletions, creations, you name it. And those collections, observations, are actually going to be evaluated by that machine learning and analytics tool that's identified patterns indicating that data has been corrupted. And that's a very important distinction in terms of other solutions on the market. Since we're looking at full content analytics and not just the metadata, we're looking at patterns and not signatures. So the analysis is going to be far more effective and doesn't need to be updated as frequently. When we're talking about CyberSense, we have a 95% success rate when it comes to a baseline scan in finding corrupted data. From the second scan on, we're talking about 99.5% success rate in finding corruption. The closest alternative on the market today provides somewhere between 87 to 88% success rate in finding similar corruption. As I mentioned, they are focused on looking at metadata, not the entire picture in terms of the full content analytics. Jeremy, I've been doing a lot of talking. I'm going to hand things over to you now and talk about the data vaulting process for us.
Thank you, Patrick. Share my screen. All right. So Patrick has talked a lot about, kind of why we are where we are today when it comes to cyber threats, and really, why we should be thinking about putting a cyber recovery strategy in place, right? So now let's talk a little bit about, how we actually do that. So just kind of looking at a very high level, the drawing that's on the screen here, right? We're going to kind of tie this back to what Patrick was talking to earlier around our strategy and kind of taking that good, better, best approach, right? So good really being just, we have to start with having a good copy of our backup in the first place, right? If we don't have a good copy of our backup in the first place, none of this is really going to work. So the foundation of our solution is going to be, the PowerProtect data domain being utilized as the protection storage target. So the good side of the house, protecting your environment to that appliance, we have the capability to extend that into kind of a better strategy, if you will, around building out an offline cyber recovery vault, right? So the key to that is keeping it off of the network. So we would typically do this by, creating a point-to-point connection between our PowerProtect data domain that's on the production backup side, and then the one that's in the vault environment that's separated from the production network. We create a point-to-point connection, so we're avoiding any type of man-in-the-middle attack that way. And then the idea there is to create, a replication strategy where it can be something that you can control manually. It's something that you can be scheduling periodically, but it's all going to be controlled from within the vault. And the key to that, right, is the backup software on the production storage, or the production side of the house, I should say, is not going to be aware of the copies in the vault. So we're really keeping those backups and letting the PowerProtect data domain control the replication process, which is actually being controlled by the vault itself and the software that we're running within the vault. So let's dive into that a little bit further. So if we're talking about the data domain, and again, there's going to be certain advantages for sure to utilizing our backup software with the PowerProtect data domain, but the PowerProtect data domain can work with just about any backup vendor out there. So no matter what you're using, if you're protecting it and writing the backups to a data domain, it's using what we call an M tree, which is really just the way it kind of logically separates the data within the data domain. So when the backups are performed to that M tree, what we're doing is we're creating a replication context that's going to replicate that entire M tree copy to the cyber recovery vault appliance. So we're going to create this logical air gap through this point-to-point connection that we were talking about. We're going to open it up, controlled by the software here, replicate the data in, and you'll see this within the interface as what we call a sync. So it's doing a sync copy lock process. It's just a screenshot of the process here, which we'll show you shortly when we dive into the demo, so you can see it in a little more detail. So once that replication has occurred and the copy has been moved into the cyber recovery vault, we're now going to utilize some additional functionality that's available on our PowerProtect data domain. And this is really how we're able to create those immutable copies, right? So it's a combination of technologies called fast copy and retention lock that Patrick was referring to earlier. So this is what would be considered kind of that better strategy, right? So having a good copy of your backup on the left-hand side for the production environment, and then extending that to create this offline air-gapped vault with an additional appliance, and then the cyber recovery software managing the process for you. So once we have the retention lock copies here, we're able to, apply a level of retention to those copies and keep multiple copies within the vault environment as well. So we typically equate that to kind of where you are from like an operational recovery standpoint. So if you're trying to keep, a couple weeks to a month or a month and a half of daily copies, we're going to try to keep something similar within the vault. So you're going to have that period of time to go back within the vault. So the idea is to give you a copy that you're always going to be able to recover from, which is great. But how can we enhance that even further into that best strategy? So that's kind of building upon and adding in the analytics that Patrick was referring to earlier, right? So we have the copies within the vault. Now we can schedule and run analytics against them and look at the behavior. So it's going to use things like machine learning, and it's going to look for differences within the data. It's going to look specifically using that full content analytics to see if ransomware is within any of the copies. And then it's going to be able to alert you to that and point you directly to a copy that's been infected, right? So this is one of the things that often comes up in conversations with customers today, right? And, Patrick talked a little bit about this in regards to, how cyber recovery solution is going to be different than disaster recovery, right? So the disaster recovery scenario, we're backing up our information to the production appliance here and we need to have a disaster recovery strategy in place as well. But to Patrick's point, there's nothing that's going to stop if it makes its way into the backups from that being replicated over to your disaster recovery environment. You're not going to be able to recover from there either. So the point of this and differentiating this between what we typically do with disaster recovery is keeping this offline, keeping it separated. This is going to be closed down when that replication process is not happening, and then applying these retention locks to it. So you're going to have a copy within this vault environment to recover from should cyber attack get past all of your proactive measures that you have in place today. And the analytics are going to be able to tell you and pinpoint you to the specific copy. So it's going to learn, it's going to look at the behavior, it's going to figure out that that something is within the backup copy, and it's going to be able to alert you to it. Now we have lots of different ways that we can work with you to get the communication outbound from the vault. Things like data diodes, firewalls, things of that nature to give you a one-way communication outbound, to your operations center, and vice versa if you want to be able to manage the vault infrastructure from the production environment. So we certainly have ways that we can help you in that regard as well. So, the analytics is really going to pinpoint you to this copy, right? It's going to tell you that it found an infected backup set. It's going to tell you exactly which copy it is. So if you do have to recover now, you know which copy is infected, and you know which one, more importantly, that you need to go back to be able to recover from. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about shrinking that, recovery time objective. And then beyond that, within the vault, extending it even further, we have customers that will also add in a level of compute, right? So now you can perform regular tests within the vault. Maybe you're going to perform recoveries, maybe add in some of your application dependencies like Active Directory, DNS, some of those things, within the vault. And now you've got your own isolated environment from the production side where you can do a regular cyber recovery test, similar to what you might be doing today around disaster recovery testing. So that's kind of high level how the solution works and the approach that we're talking through with customers around that good, better, best strategy, right? And it's one of those things that doesn't all have to be done at once. And it's a strategy that we can work towards with you, depending on what requirements you have. So now let's go in and actually show this in action. So this is the cyber recovery software that would be running within the Vault environment. This is, the main interface. So you're looking at a dashboard here, which we saw the screenshot, and we can see that this environment is currently locked. That means that the communication between the two appliances is disabled at the moment. We can see the last few jobs that have run here, your typical dashboard information. So we're going to go really high level and at least show you kind of how it works. So some of what we were talking through earlier in the slide deck, that sync copy lock process here. So we've actually got a replication context configured within the software here. You can see as part of that context, it is the M-tree replication that I was referring to in the slides as well. So if we edit this and give you a look at what that looks like, pretty straightforward process. It's going to be using the Vault data domain, and this port is going to be the port that's being used. So that's going to be the port that's got the direct connection to the one that's on the production side. And then from here, we can apply, our retention level as well as the retention lock type. So the retention lock type is important as well because we have the capability to use compliance mode retention, which is really going to require multiple levels of authentication before any data can be deleted. So that's how we're able to create the immutable copies within the Vault. So we can kick this process off manually. We can run it on a schedule. I've had customers ask me, because everything that we're really talking about here is being controlled by the software. We're enabling the port when the replication process is happening. So, when we think of air gap, it's more of a logical air gap, right? But we have customers that will take it as far as, Once that process is done, they'll physically break the connection and plug it back in before the next one runs. And they're kind of doing their own thing manually. There's lots of different ways you can go about controlling that process, but we can certainly automate it for you within the Cyber Recovery Vault as well. So we can kick it off manually here just to show you what it looks like, or hand it back to Patrick. So this is going to do that sync, copy, lock process that we were talking about. So to see that that process is running, I can show you the Vault data domain. So this is that V1 interface that we were looking at within the replication context. So if I go back here now and look at the main dashboard, just wait for this to refresh, and we can see that it's now unlocked, right? Because it's in the middle of initiating the replication to occur for that sync, copy, lock process. And now if I refresh here, I can also see that that port is now enabled. So that interface is up and running while the replication process is taking place. And once it completes, it's going to shut this, back down and lock it again. And you can come in through the management software here and secure your vault at any time. So whether you have replication that's happening, whether it's scheduled, whether it's something kicked off manually, you can come in here and shut it down at any time as well through the software. So that's a very high level overview just to show you kind of how the process works. And with that, I'm gonna pass the ball back to you, Patrick.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Excellent. All right, team. So to bring us home, I know we're coming in on the last, 6 or 7 minutes here. So I do want to talk about how this PowerProtect cyber recovery solution is really different than any approach that you're seeing from any of the other major data protection vendors on the market today. And when we think about this, I really boil it down to 3 unique areas. The first one is going to be isolation. So unlike any other vendor today who's talking about isolation as it relates to separation from production, we take advantage of both logical isolation as well as physical isolation via this air-gapped vault. And the vault piece is very critical here, right? Because the cyber bad actors do not have access to the vault. And our vaulting process is really built with security in mind, as Jeremy was walking through there. That automated replication process is controlled from the secure vaulted side, which is a significant differentiator from other solutions on the market that are still network facing with what they'll call their air gap solutions, right? And finally, from an isolation standpoint, our vaulting architecture is certified to a standard. As I mentioned earlier, Sheltered Harbor is the most advanced specification for data vaulting in the world. And PowerProtect Cyber Recovery is the only product endorsed to meet their stringent data vaulting requirements. Moving beyond isolation, the second biggest differentiator here would be immutability. As I talked about earlier, for us, cyber recovery isn't just a capability that's marketed on our website or by an internet blogger. It's a mature, dedicated solution. And therefore, you have the support that it entails being a dedicated solution. So we're not dependent on a single point of failure, or we don't rely on platform dependence. When we talk about immutability, it's not just a buzzword. Our retention lock meets the SEC compliance worm immutability standards. So that means we're not susceptible to administrative or security overrides. And as we talked about earlier, we're the only solution on the market with NTP hardening to prevent time clock manipulation and time drift. And finally, the third major differentiator is around our intelligence and machine learning analytics. No other vendor provides the integration of analytics, full content data integrity audits, and confidence that PowerProtect Cyber Recovery does with CyberSense. Right? With CyberSense, we're taking advantage of full content indexing, not just the metadata, and building on top of that, we have the machine learning and analytics that resides and operates within the air-gapped vault, a secure clean room with the utmost security top of mind. right? So you don't have to send your data across the network to the cloud or across a risky compromised network for analysis. All of that is done within the vaulted environment. And the reporting that you get from CyberSense, the additional intelligence, can be used to inform root cause and help accelerate your recovery process, right? And when we're thinking about this whole cyber recovery vault architecture, the number one problem that we're solving for, and the number one question that we can help you answer is, can this data be used for recovery? So a lot of information here, and understands that we've hit a lot of different topics, and clearly there's more for future conversations if that's something you're interested in. What I want to wrap things up with here is, what's an appropriate best step from here, next step from here? You know, a lot of times customers will say, this is great, Patrick, but we don't even know where to start. Like, we're doing X, Y, and Z today. What makes the most sense? What does Dell Technologies recommend? Well, you don't have to eat the elephant, right? Our recommendation working with our customers, if you want to deploy this type of modern cyber recovery vault infrastructure, is to start now and start small. A lot of times what we're focusing in on is what we would call critical rebuild materials. And that's really been developed having deployed hundreds of these solutions around the globe to organizations of all shapes and sizes. What is the most important pieces of data and applications for recovery purposes from this type of incident? And a lot of times what we're pointing to, some of these have been brought up already: Active Directory, DNS dumps, maybe it's some of your networking environments, critical storage applications, IP information. I'll let you read for yourself, and we're happy to provide this information following today's conversation. But this is something we can work together with you. Typically, Jeremy and I are recommending to our customers, if nothing else, start by protecting 10 or 20% of your most critical applications within this vaulted environment today. And at least that puts you on the path to being able to recover what's most important, the lifeline of your business. And it helps you eliminate any concerns around having to pay a ransom. Eliminates any concerns around the amount of a ransom, potentially being thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, right? Not necessary with cyber recovery. When it comes to the probability or possibility of recovery, we're assuring you that you have clean gold copies to recover from. And finally, most important to probably all of you out there, protecting your revenue streams and protecting the services of the people that you support. We're talking about being able to recover within a matter of day, 2 days, depending on pre-planning and the specific attack, versus weeks to possibly months with some of the more severe attacks that we're seeing more and more of. With that, I know we're at the top of the hour. I will hand things back to Dwayne here, but on behalf of the Dell Technologies team, thank you all for hanging in there. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. You have fantastic team of resources on the data network side, starting with Dwayne. Dwayne, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Jeremy, as well. We are at the top of the hour, but if anyone has a question, please use the chat feature to submit that now. I will wait just a little bit to see if anyone does have a question that we can answer at this point. And we can't allow Patrick and Jeremy to add anything, specifically Jeremy, since Patrick, you just finished up, if you wanted to add anything before we wrap up. No? Okay. So great. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate everyone for coming out to today's webinar. If you need any more information, or if you want to request a demo, please reach out to your data network's account executive, and they'll be able to set that up for you. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again.